So in 2021, we saw these incredible images from Kunming, China. In just a few minutes, 12 skyscrapers worth over $150 million were demolished into a cloud of dust. It was dramatic, shocking, and also a bit mysterious. Why would China spend so much money building these towers only to tear them down almost immediately? Well, in today's video, we'll reveal all of the secrets behind this amazing demolition. We'll uncover how it relates to China's mind-blowing plans for the future, and what happens when an entire nation gets stuck in a never-ending cycle of debt, construction, and demolition. Before we jump in though, give us a thumbs up and stay tuned for more insights on global economics. And if you want to learn more about how the world economy works, check out our Economics Basics playlist. You can learn about everything from basic concepts to current events. All right, let's start with a quick recap of what exactly happened in Kunming. Basically, the 12 buildings were part of a business district in the southwest of the country. They were all built within the span of just 2 years from 2019 to 2021. And then suddenly it was decided that they should be removed, allowing space for a new park and riverfront walkway. For perspective, let me show you some photos of the site before and after the demolition. Before. Now after. It's hard to believe that all of this was made possible by just 27 controlled demolitions. The whole process took less than 20 seconds. How did they do it? Well, each of these buildings had explosive charges attached to the main load-bearing columns. Once triggered, these explosions caused the columns to buckle, causing the entire structure to collapse. Now, the reason why they chose to demolish these particular buildings was because the area was prone to flooding. The buildings were constantly getting waterlogged, which meant that they weren't very useful for anything else besides maybe farming. But it wasn't just that. It was also a symbolic moment. You see, these towers represented a different era of China's breakneck economic growth. For nearly 3 decades, the country had been expanding relentlessly, all for the sake of progress. But now it seems like the leadership in Beijing has realized that they might have taken things too far. You see, China has grown so big that it is becoming harder and harder for them to keep growing at the same pace. And to make matters worse, their previous approach isn't sustainable anymore. So in 2023, Xi Jinping announced a new era for China, officially declaring the end of the country's explosive growth days. Instead, the Chinese president wants his country to focus on innovation, sustainability, and quality of life. He stated, "We must shift from a high speed to high quality, from extensive growth to intensive growth." This is a huge change of pace for China. The question is, why did they decide to stop? Well, until recently, the government hadn't really cared too much about whether or not their economic growth benefited ordinary Chinese citizens. Their focus was primarily on the headline numbers. And as long as those numbers kept going up, everything seemed to be fine. This worked pretty well for quite some time. By 2021, China had become the second largest economy in the world, right behind the US. And according to the IMF, China's economy will overtake America's by 2028. At this rate, it won't be surprising if China becomes the first country to ever surpass a $30 trillion economy. But here's the thing. endless expansion doesn't always lead to actual progress. All of this economic growth has come at a cost. China now has some of the most polluted air and water in the entire world. And despite being a country full of young, healthy people, it has one of the fastest aging populations on the planet. That's why it feels like China has reached a breaking point. Something's got to give. And in order to figure out what that something is, let's take a look at China's economic targets for the future. According to the 14th Five-Year Plan, China aims to sustain a steady 5% annual growth between 2025 and 2035. It sounds reasonable, right? Well, for context, here are some other countries' targets for comparison. The UK is aiming for 2%, Europe 2%, and the USA is targeting 1.8%. As you can see, even 5% is considered very ambitious for a country as big as China. But they're not aiming for just any type of growth either. If we zoom into the chart, you'll notice that this growth isn't consistent. There are ups and downs along the way. These fluctuations don't happen randomly. They're actually planned by the government. See, while it's good to have a steady average growth rate, you don't want your economy fluctuating all over the place. Because if it does, you'll enter a situation known as secular stagnation, where the economy ends up bouncing around in a range for a prolonged period of time. And it's definitely not something that you want to happen. It is for this reason that the government tries to manipulate the economy, so that the fluctuations are minimal. In order to achieve this goal, the average growth rate needs to be around 5%. That means that some years China's GDP might grow by 7% and others by just 2%. But when you average them out, you end up with a nice steady line moving upwards. But here's where things get a little confusing, because in order to reach this target, China uses a weird metric called GDP, or Gross Domestic Product. And although it's widely regarded as the best measure of economic performance, it's not perfect. You see, GDP measures the total monetary value of everything a country produces and sells on the market. To calculate it, you add up the value of all the goods and services in an economy over a certain period of time. For example, if a company makes $100 worth of products and sells them all, then that company contributes $100 towards the country's GDP. So if you want to boost a country's GDP, you basically just need to increase the amount of stuff that's being sold. And historically, this has led to some pretty strange outcomes. For example, imagine you build a highway, then tear it down and rebuild it again. Would that be considered progress? Well, thanks to GDP, it would be. Every time you build, tear down, and rebuild the highway, you're adding to the total value of the economy. GDP would rise, but that wouldn't really be what we consider real progress. This is a huge problem for China because for a very long time, their economic progress has been based on making more highways, factories, and buildings. And now that they've made enough of these things, further expansion no longer makes sense. So China is facing a unique dilemma. They need to keep growing their economy by a ridiculous amount in order to maintain their living standards. But at the same time, they don't want to fall into the trap of endlessly producing useless structures. So how do they get around this? The answer, of course, lies in the everyday activities of the people. The solution to China's problem is simple. Get their citizens to buy more stuff. When people consume more goods and services, companies produce more goods and services. And when companies produce more, they hire more workers. More workers means more salaries. More salaries means more spending. And the cycle continues. However, right now, China's consumers aren't spending enough. Only about 39% of China's GDP comes directly from household consumption. In order to put that number into perspective, let's look at some other countries. In the USA, for example, around 68% of the economy comes from consumer spending. In the UK, it's around 62%, and in Japan, it's around 53%. So China's household consumption is significantly lower than the rest of the world. And even worse, this number has been declining since the pandemic. After the lockdowns, consumer confidence dropped sharply. So many Chinese families started saving more and spending less. And even though this is great news for individual savers, it's terrible news for the economy as a whole. Because if everyone starts saving more, then investment and production will go down. As a result, GDP growth will decline. Some might argue that it's not a problem if GDP declines, right? Wouldn't that be a good thing after all of the damage they've done to the environment? Well, sadly, it's not that simple. You see, for the past 18 months, China has been dealing with a serious issue called deflation. Deflation occurs when prices steadily decrease over time. For example, let's say that in January 2022, a TV cost 1,000 yuan, but by July 2023, the same TV was selling for only 800 yuan. If this trend continues, eventually the TV will become so cheap that it loses all of its value and no one will buy it. At that point, the manufacturer will have no choice but to fire their employees. Without demand for their product, they can't afford to keep paying their staff. This is why deflation is such a serious issue for China. Right now, prices have been steadily declining for 18 months. And if this goes on for too long, it could trigger a vicious cycle of unemployment, reduced spending, and even lower prices. To make matters worse, there's not much they can do to solve this problem either. Unlike the Federal Reserve in the USA, who can raise interest rates to combat inflation, China can't do the same. That's because the Chinese economy relies heavily on exports. If China increases interest rates, the cost of borrowing becomes more expensive. Higher borrowing costs means higher production costs. And if production costs rise, it becomes more expensive for Chinese businesses to export their products overseas. Higher export prices mean fewer buyers. And when China's exporters sell less, their economy slows down even more. So given how difficult it is for them to boost demand or control inflation, what can China do to avoid a recession? Well, the obvious solution is to get people to spend more. So that's exactly what the government is trying to do. They have come up with 3 strategies to solve this problem. More money, less saving, and more spending. According to official statements, China will raise the national minimum wage, encourage companies to give their workers more paid leave, and expand access to